began at the moment of creation, and that God existing without the universe is simply timeless. Now that's going to mean that God has to exist changelessly, and that will raise questions about God's thought life, as you said. But let's hold on to those questions until we get to the conclusion. But I think you'll see the direction that Al-Ghazali would go. He would say that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, and that therefore nothing can exist from eternity past, whether it be God or the universe.
In a discussion I had going back to premise one with an atheist, going back to premise one and basically denying that, basically this fellow said, and then I came across it also on the web, that an infinite past is not a sufficient condition to deduce the existence of a beginning. Is not a sufficient condition. It's perfectly coherent to posit, as many atheists do, that the universe has a finite past and yet does not have a beginning. So it's finite, but it does not have a beginning. This struck me as rather bizarre.
Yeah.
And then they go on, some will go on to say modern cosmology agrees with this position. And I'm thinking, I have not come across this. So how is it that one can claim that there's a finite past but yet does not have a beginning? Is this some slippery
The only way, Jerry, that I could think that you could have a finite past without a beginning is by having circular time. If time is circular, then prior to event E, there has only been a finite amount of time, but there wouldn't be a beginning. But so long as we think of time as linear, which it surely is, I think cyclical time is metaphysically absurd, then if the distance that the past has is finite, if there's a finite number of years, say, that the universe has existed, if the past is finite, then it clearly did have a beginning. In fact, that's how I would define the notion of beginning. You could say time has a beginning if and only if, for any non-zero interval of time that you pick, there are only a finite number of intervals prior to today. For any non-zero finite interval that you pick, there are only a finite number of those intervals prior to today. If that is true, then time had a beginning. Or an alternate definition would be to say that for any non-zero finite interval, if there was a first interval of that duration, then time had a beginning. So if you have a first year, say, or a first second, then time had a beginning. So I think that a necessary and sufficient condition for having a beginning, if time is linear, is the past being finite. Now, I suspect what's going on here, this is what I'll bet is going on, is that they're imagining this to be like a geometrical line, which has, say, an end point here and maybe an end point in the present. And they're saying, let's erase or pluck out that end point or beginning point so that now there isn't any beginning point, see, because we plucked out the point 0. So it would be like a series of fractions converging toward 0 as a limit, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16. And there isn't going to be any first member of that series, right? There is no smallest fraction. So in that sense, there isn't any beginning point. But that doesn't mean that the past or that the universe doesn't have a beginning, in the sense that it is finite. It had a beginning, even if it doesn't have a beginning point. So, for example, if we had a performance of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and we were to pluck out the very first instant of the symphony, it wouldn't have a beginning point. But clearly, the symphony hasn't been going on for infinite time. It still is finite. It still had a beginning, even if it didn't have a beginning point. So I think that that objection is just quite confused. Any other question? Good question.
I'm not sure I'm going to understand the answer, but I'll risk it. I have heard in response to the Hilbert Hotel absurdity that the actual absurdity in that case is not due to the absurdity of an actual infinite, but rather the absurdity of the impossibility of a supertask.
Mm-hmm. Let's explain what a supertask is. A supertask has to do with performing an infinite number of operations in a finite time. For example, imagine a mechanical arm that moves marbles from a pile here and puts them in a tray over here. And in the first half minute, the mechanical arm moves one marble. In the next quarter minute, it moves another marble. In the next 8th minute, it moves another marble. In the next 16th minute, it moves another, until it just becomes a blur. Well, at the end of 1 minute, the marbles will have all been transferred over into the other tray, and so the mechanical arm will have done an infinite number of operations in a finite time. Now, this is not relevant so much to the first argument based on Hilbert's Hotel, because in Hilbert's Hotel it has nothing to do, as you can see, with performing operations successively. Hilbert's Hotel would say simply, you can't have an infinite collection of marbles. Whether you're moving them with a mechanical arm or not, there cannot be an infinite collection of marbles. This notion of supertasks is relevant really to the second argument that Al-Ghazali gave, that you cannot complete an actual infinite by one operation at a time. And in the supertask, this is an attempt to say, yes, you can, if you just keep doing it faster and faster. You can count to infinity. You could count the marbles. You could have a register that as the mechanical arm moved the marble, it would count them. And so at the end of the operation, the counter would have counted an infinite number of marbles have been transferred. And so you can count to infinity after all. Well, to my mind, although there have been a great deal of philosophical discussion of these so-called supertasks, to me, these are nothing more than imaginative thought experiments that have no relation to reality at all. They're just mathematical stories that cannot be really actualized. They're metaphysically impossible to do that. And one way to see this, I think, is to realize that if the mechanical arm has moved one marble at a time, and it has finally filled up the left-hand tray, that means there must have been a last marble that it moved, right? But there cannot be such a thing. There is no infinitieth marble in a collection of an infinite number of marbles. So the whole notion is simply metaphysically absurd. You have to say that somehow the mechanical arm managed to move all of the marbles, but it never moved a last marble, because that's impossible, that there be a last marble. But that seems to me absurd. As long as it's moving them one at a time, there would have to be a last marble. So I think these so-called supertasks are nothing more than fairy stories, really. They have no relation to reality at all.
Well, I think what the objection, though, was that you can't move an infinite number of guests in the hotel because that would be a supertask. And as you say,
I see. Well, no, that's not true at all. I mean, that's easy to imagine, that all of the guests have their watches synchronized so that at 3 o'clock they all get up and move out of their room and go next door into the next room. And so that wouldn't be a big deal, I think. And we could even imagine that they do it by teleportation, as in Star Wars, where they step into their transporter and they just, dematerialize here and then materialize in the transporter in the other room without traversing the distance in between. So nobody's contending that a Hilbert's Hotel wouldn't present physical problems. I mean, we're just imagining this, but I think it illustrates the absurdities of having a hotel that is fully occupied, but that can accommodate infinitely more guests simply by moving them around. Yes?
Is a law of mathematics that all numbers can be multiplied by any chance? I mean, it seems like if all numbers can be multiplied, then you could multiply infinite, and infinity is a number.
Yes, that's
then
right.
you could always multiply infinity. You could do infinity times infinity, and
Yes, that's
infinity
right.
times infinity again, over and over and over
Yes.
again. And you could go on doing that for infinity, so you could never get to the end, and therefore you can never get a hotel with an infinite number of rooms that can't be multiplied again. Because it's always going to be able to multiply another set
Well,
of
let's be
rooms.
careful here. You're quite right in saying that we can multiply with infinite quantities. In fact, there is a whole system of transfinite arithmetic that involves the multiplication and addition of infinite quantities, and they have very unexpected and curious results. But to say that an infinite number can be multiplied isn't to say that it is multiplied. You could have an actually infinite number of guests in the hotel and just not multiply them. Now, you could multiply them. You could say that each guest has, say, 2 coins in his pocket. So how many coins are there? Well, it will be infinity times 2, right? And so there you do multiply it. But you don't have to do that. So there can exist infinites which aren't multiplied, but you are quite right in saying that you can multiply and add infinite quantities. What you can't do with them is these inverse operations of subtraction and division. You cannot say what is infinity minus infinity or infinity divided by infinity. That leads to self-contradictions, and that's what happens when I imagine the hotel guests checking out. In that case, you have identical quantities minus identical quantities with non-identical remainders left over, so that it becomes mathematically absurd.
Seems like the infinite can never be reached. An actual infinite
I
of
agree
even
with
numbers
that.
can't be reached.
I agree that it can't be reached. That was Al-Ghazali's second argument,
Okay.
that if you could have an infinite hotel, or an infinite number of marbles, or an infinite number of baseball cards, you could never go through them one at a time. That's the second argument, that an infinite past cannot have been formed by one event occurring after another, one domino falling at a time.
So his argument is basically that the hotel can't exist. A hotel with
Right.
an
There
infinite
are
number of
two
guests.
arguments here. One is that an actual infinite number of things cannot exist. If you're not convinced by that argument, all right, here's a second argument. Even if an actually infinite number of things can exist, you can't get through them one at a time the way the past has been formed. So there are two independent arguments here that both need to be refuted if the person is to reject the second premise that the universe began to exist.
Thank you.
Any other comment on these philosophical arguments?
This is simply in reference to the supertask question and the issue that he was raising. Is Hilbert's hotel time dependent? Does it matter in this argument with regard to Hilbert's hotel whether we move all the guests in the first 2 minutes or the first infinity of minutes, or in 6 years or 5 years? Is it time dependent? Is that any issue even at
I
all
don't
in
think
the
that it is.
Okay.
In fact, I would say that in one sense, the guests don't even have to actually move. We can just imagine in our minds what would happen if he moved 1 into 2, 2 into 3, 3 into 4, and so forth. Or 1 into 2, 2 into 4, 3 into 6, and so forth. And then we can imagine him doing it in reverse order. I think the absurdity is illustrated just by imagining how these operations could happen, and you can see that this is absurd. So I don't think it depends on time at all, or even the actual carrying out of the operations.